Well, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for what I hope to be lively and rich and thought-provoking discussion about regenerative agriculture. My first question kind of embeds introductions, so I'm going to start off with that, and you'll get a chance to get to know my fellow panelists and learn more about what regenerative agriculture is and what that means to them in the context of their work. So, good to see you all. While introducing yourself, please share how your organization understands the phrase regenerative agriculture. How is it different from industrial agriculture, and what is your organization doing to advance regenerative ag? John, we'll kick it off to you.
All right. I'm John Piotti. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called American Farmland Trust. And we were the... Not working? That better? Okay. I'm John Piotti. I'm the president of American Farmland Trust. And we were the first national organization to really view agriculture and environmental issues as two sides of the same coin. We were founded in 1980, and from the beginning we've really had a systems perspective. We've been about the land itself, the practices that occur on that land, and the stewards, our ranchers and farmers who work that land. And we've also, from the beginning, drawn a connection that for this group isn't needed, but for a lot of people is, and that's the notion that farms and food are interconnected, something that sadly a lot of people don't fully understand. And so with this perspective, our focus on regenerative agriculture is naturally holistic. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about Norm Borlaug. I want to introduce another Norm, who some of you who know anything about conservation agriculture will know. That's Norm Berg. He was President Carter's appointee to head up the Soil Conservation Service before NRCS was around, and really was the banner holder for conservation agriculture since going back many years. The first one to really carry it high since Henry Wallace and the Dust Bowl. And Norm, he lost his job when Reagan came into office in 1980, and he came to work for American Farmland Trust for 26 years. So we had the opportunity to really have the national expert in conservation practices in our own shop. And we've been focusing on soil health, climate smart, regenerative practices, whatever you want to call it, for all those years. But for us, regenerative agriculture is different than just regenerative practices. Regenerative agriculture is necessarily a system, and it's about healthful food, abundant food, it's about environmental services, it's about climate change, it's about opportunities for historically disadvantaged farmers. It's all of those things. So that's how we define it, right? It is about a long-term, sustainable system that is ultimately going to help us heal our planet. You asked about industrial agriculture, and I know where you're coming with that question, right? There are forms of agriculture that are incredibly intensive and are based on fossil fuels and are truly not sustainable in any way and have a lot more environmental harm than they should. But I don't really want to sort of embrace the notion, because in my mind, industrial is not a bad word. All farmers are industrious, and agriculture that's going to be successful has to simultaneously serve economic and environmental goals. So I don't want to sort of put up this dichotomy that there's this niche thing called regenerative ag, this boutique thing, and then there's the rest of ag. I see it as agriculture. And we need farms of all sizes and all types, and we need all of them to do better by the environment. And that's what regenerative ag is all about.
That's great. We had a very similar internal conversation when we were talking about industrial agriculture, regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture, and the decision my team and I came to was very similar from the conventional versus unconventional landscape, right? We don't want to try and divide farmers into these two camps. We're all trying to produce food and steward the environment in a regenerative, sustainable way, and it actually does us a disservice by, completely ignoring or shaming one group.
Absolutely, and I mentioned AFT came together because we were formed because in the 1970s, farmers and environmental community were really at loggerheads. And you can argue in some ways they still are, but not like they were then. And
You and I are sharing a stage.
yeah, exactly. So I think the world has changed. It obviously needs to change more, but we don't do any good by villainizing any party.
Great, thanks. And that norms sounds like a great scoop for AFT's beginnings.
Yes, yeah. Having Norm Berg on the staff really made a huge difference.
Great. Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, my name is Michael Kutotowa Johnson. I'm an assistant specialist at the Indigenous Resilience Center, where we mainly focus on food, water, and energy. But more importantly, I'm a 250th generation farmer. I'm from the Hopi Indian Reservation, where regenerative is a term that we often talk about, but we barely understand. And so I've kind of redefined that. So I'm going to read you my little definition of how indigenous people look at indigenous agriculture. I could say indigenous agriculture is the process of incorporating indigenous place-based ways of knowing and land use management schemes adapted for survival, which are supported by culture, belief systems, and community incorporated over millennia. And so it's those pockets in biodiversity that we have here on the globe now that are very important, that I feel like we need to revitalize. You know, I understand economics goes hand in hand with agriculture, but to me there's different types of economics. So the word eco, you know, like ecology and economics go hand in hand. It's just that sometimes we forgot about that, right? And so what I'm trying to do is trying to revitalize indigenous agricultural systems throughout the globe, starting with my own at Hopi. And in a couple of next year I'll start with this All Pueblo Indian Agricultural Project, because you know a lot of the policies that we come from the United States. So why not develop something good from the United States for once? You know, I'm not saying that all policy is bad, but let's do something that more people can understand, that we can relate to. And to me, it's about putting values ahead of economics, at least at the initial onset. But thank you so much.
Yeah. And actually, can I ask a follow-up? Can you share more about how the belief systems and the spiritual components, how that plays into traditional or indigenous farming systems?
Well, I mean, for an example, there's no real separation between our belief system and cultural system and our agricultural practices. I mean, when you look at a baby boy or baby girl, when they're raised, after 2 weeks, they're placed a small little piece of sweet corn pudding in their mouth just to tie them to the ground. So it's that well integrated into our system. You know, our system is based upon need and survival. It's not based upon anything else but that. And so that seems to trump over everything we do. It's incorporated within all of our ceremonies. They depend upon each other for the foods we raise and for the future. And so, for example, you know, this is just one of our Hopi sweet corns. You see this in the museum, but it's still growing. You know, there's generations after generations to produce something like this. This is a sweet corn variety that we have. It grows in the desert with only 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year at depths of anywhere from 6 to 18 inches. You know, I get accused of being a bush farmer because when my crops come up, they look like bushes, but they're really nutritious, and I can't help explain that. And so yeah, so I always carry corn around with me, so it's just one of my things.
Great.
But anyways.
Thanks for that. Simon.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Simon Winter. I'm the Executive Director of the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture. And the name Syngenta obviously is synonymous with a very large seed and crop protection company, but we're very independent from the company. We are funded by the company, but our focus is entirely on helping very low-income smallholder farmers in Africa and Asia to have thriving farms and thriving businesses, and back to your point about economics, really linking them to markets so they can sell their produce and end up with a living income as a result. And we're far from that. Put climate change on top of that, and we have even more problems facing those farmers that we're trying to support than they were facing 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I did some of my own field research about 7 years ago and visited farmers in several African countries. And they were facing climate change. They knew what climate change was. They were dealing with the consequences of it. So for us, regenerative agriculture is how do we help farmers not just go on the traditional pathway towards improved productivity and increased yields, which is very important, of course, but have farms that are very resilient and increasingly resilient to these increasing climate pressures. That's really the heart of it. And then what are the different innovations in terms of practices, in terms of technologies, in terms of ways of farming, and how do you help the farmers diversify their farms so that this resilience piece is at the heart of what regenerative agriculture becomes for these farmers. And resilience not just in the ability to withstand the increased likelihood of extreme weather events or other types of shocks associated with climate change, but resilience that allows them to continue to improve through those crises as well. That's really got this ongoing improvement has got to be at the heart of regenerative agriculture. So for us, I agree with the earlier comments that for us it's not a dichotomy between industrial agriculture and regenerative agriculture. For these low-income farmers, it's about bringing the best of their traditional practices, back to what you were talking about, and the best modern practices together so that they can thrive. And that requires a lot of experimentation and a lot of trial and error to get it right in the very, very local conditions that those farmers live in.
Can you share a little bit more about how Syngenta Foundation works with and promotes that sort of experimentation on the ground?
So we're very much a demand-based, needs-based organization. So the first thing is really what are the needs and what are the opportunities of farmers in any particular community, and then we will scout around and look for, are there improved seed varieties, are there different types of soil amendments, are there different types of conservation agriculture practices, for example, that will work best to those farmers' advantages to help them meet the needs and the opportunities they face. And then we'll do a lot of field trials. We have centers of excellence in different countries, very close to the farms, and then we work with people from the farming communities themselves, young people with entrepreneurial aspirations who want to stay in their communities but maybe aren't satisfied to be farmers like their parents were, to become entrepreneurial change agents in their communities, what we sometimes call the first mile of agri-entrepreneurship. And we're building large-scale networks so that we can then work with people in the communities so that it's not just the experimentation part, which is really important, but it's also then the delivery part gets enabled as well.
Great, thanks for that. I like the rebrand, entrepreneurial change agents. I might seek a title change within my own organization to support that. And great, I'll close the loop on this question. My name is Arohi Sharma. I'm the Deputy Director of Regenerative Agriculture with the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's an environmental nonprofit organization based in the United States, but we have offices in Beijing in China and in New Delhi in India. Our experience with regenerative agriculture is kind of a love story that's evolved over 8-10 years. And I don't know, for folks in this room, when you all encountered the phrase or encountered the word, but for our team, it was about 3 or 4 years ago when we started noticing regenerative ag sort of pop up in the mainstream a little bit more. We got curious and decided to embark on this really exciting research project where instead of focusing on, distilling scientific literature and journals and different media forms, we went back to the farmers and the ranchers. We interviewed 113 farmers and ranchers across the United States to learn more about what regenerative agriculture means to them, what it looks like to them on the field, on the ground, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, and really build a policy platform based on the lived experiences of those growers. So we have this wonderful plethora. If you've met a farmer, if you've met a rancher, you know that they are incredibly skilled storytellers. We have this plethora, this treasure trove of information where we now built a policy platform off of. Our understanding through that process of distilling what we learned from these 113 growers really pulls from what the three of you have already shared, which is this philosophy of farming, this philosophy of ranching, where your folks grow in harmony with nature and with their communities. And kind of ingrained in that philosophy is a very place-based, context-specific, natural resource-specific approach to growing food for their communities. If you're a Hopi farmer in the middle of the desert, you're going to be growing less water-intensive crops than if you were in a more water-rich environment like the Northeast. So we we were really thrilled to learn, to try and capture all of the different variations and stories and practices across the country through this philosophy. It was nice to see a sort of systems approach to agriculture. So, given we all work on regenerative agriculture in some form or fashion, what about the approach to agriculture makes you hopeful in the fight against food insecurity and climate change? And we'll go in the reverse order. Simon, let's start with you.
So we still have a long way to go. The incentive environments in most of the countries in which we work on the policy side are still not really supporting regenerative agriculture to be adopted. There's been a lot of research done by the World Bank and big international organizations on the need to shift incentives away from, just nitrogen fixation, fertilizers being heavily subsidized and nothing else, to a smarter system. But we need to get into the details to the points we're all making about the need for highly locally relevant solutions to be incentivized. So at our foundation, actually just today, we kicked off a new piece of research with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research here in the US, with World Vision International, and the Overseas Development Institute and IDS from the UK and the World Farmers Organization. And we're going to be looking in Bangladesh and India and in Kenya at, well, what really are needed in terms of policy environments to support regenerative agriculture that's suitable and appropriate to those particular countries and even subnational farming systems within those countries. So I'm hopeful that we're seeing progress now starting to happen. I'm hopeful because we now have COP27 coming and then COP28 thereafter, that the big climate dialogues are starting to embrace food and agriculture. But I'm still cautious because it's still not the front and center issues. We're still having to campaign and advocate a lot to get airtime and focus on these issues. So I'm hopeful on that side. I'm also hopeful on the ground because what we're seeing is that we are starting to see that more diversified farming systems that are appropriate to the local food systems, the local food markets. We're seeing more partnership now between nutrition-focused organizations that are trying to encourage people to consume healthier, more diversified diets, and then linking the local farmers through local supply chains to those local food markets, that we're seeing diversified encouragement to the farmers now to say, right, let's not just produce rice or let's not just produce maize, but let's put vegetables in the mix. If it's appropriate to the local system, let's put livestock in the mix and so on as well. So we're seeing a lot of encouraging signs that there's a pull factor starting to happen, both on the policy side, as I said earlier, and on the local market side, but a long way to go.
That's great. Michael?
Yeah, for myself, I think it's just I'm getting to see that a lot of people are starting to have the realization of how valuable soils are. Not just from an economic standpoint of view, but from a human well-being standpoint of view. I mean, I always like to say that Hopi is a place that we grow corn to fit the environment and not manipulate the environment to fit the corn. It's a little bit of a different take if you really think about it. That's pretty cool. And so, but I think, my hope is also seeing the younger generation become more involved in what we're doing. I mean, I'm getting to see them now. Some organizations have youth on their boards. They need to be listened to. They are our next generation, right? And so I'm glad. So those things give me hope, I mean, maybe I'll come up with a podcast or something to even get it further. But that's one of our main things. I was told as a young man that I need to have faith in everything I do because we live in such an arid environment and it's very hard to produce crops in the desert Southwest. But we're doing it with no irrigation. And so that's just an amazing thing. But a lot of it's not only soils, but it's our seeds. These seeds have been adapted to our environment for well over 3,000 years now. And so they can grow without hardly any water. And that's just corn, beans, melons, and squash. In fact, when I was at Cornell University as an undergrad, the agronomist says, well, how can you plant that deep? It's not going to come up, and how much water is it going to take for it to come up? And I said, just watch. And 2 weeks later, it came up. Then when I left Cornell University, one of the agronomists says, can we have some of your seeds? And I said, no, that's not possible, sir. But at least I hope you can understand my message, and things like that. But anyways, so that's the hope that I like to see. That's the thing that gives me hope, is that we're starting to slow down enough to really look at the basics of what agriculture is about and what life's about. And for me, that's life and human well-being is through the soils that we're cultivating on. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and you're now working for a university, the University of Arizona. How are you noticing shifts in either research programs or field plots? How are you noticing the conversation change in academic environments when it comes to regenerative agriculture? Or are you?
Well, it's starting to move that direction. I'm working on a USDA Next Gen grant for a local tribal college out there, and I think me just being there, there's very few indigenous people in the sciences. Like my background is in science, receiving a PhD in natural resource management from the University of Arizona. But there seems to be more of an understanding of maybe we should talk to these people who have 3,000 years of knowledge. It's not to be taken for granted, because, I always used to be like, well, this is kind of a voodoo primitive way of doing things, but then now we have the White House, putting out with Office of Science, Technology, and Policy saying that, yes, traditional ecological knowledge is a science. And I could have told them that, 5 years ago, maybe we didn't have to get a PhD, right? And so it's just kind of neat, reputation observation is basically the best part of science, and so I'm just trying to push that through a little bit. But I'm getting a lot more respect, and I'm just trying to channel other people who are in my similar field to also finish up and get where they need to go. So.
That's great, thank you.
Well, I too am optimistic and hopeful with some of the caveats that are mentioned. I'm also a little wary, because I know these things, sometimes you take 2 steps forward and a few steps back as well. Members of my staff still have the scars from the Waxman-Markey debates. We led the Ag Coalition on that, and for those of you who may not know, that was really the U.S.'s first effort to put ag and climate together, and it passed in the House and failed in the Senate, and it had bigger ramifications than missed policy. It really had huge swaths of the funding community and the political community change tactics, look at international opportunities and needs, which are great, but sort of turn their back on what could be done with American agriculture. So it's great to see the last few years the tide has definitely turned. On the issue of climate in particular, I am very hopeful, and I give a lot of the credit to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 2018 report. It didn't say anything that those of us who work in the space didn't know, but it made it very clear. And what the 2018 report said is, as important as it is for us to reduce our carbon emissions, we will never meet the goals of the Paris Climate Accords only by doing that. We also have to seek natural solutions, of which one of the most powerful and certainly one of the most cost-effective is capturing atmospheric carbon and putting it back in the soil. And unlike a lot of studies, that one really resonated. It really did. And I saw a noticeable change amongst members of Congress and others after that. So I am quite hopeful, if only because the importance is so great. And American Farmland Trust teamed up with USDA ARS about 3 years ago. We developed a tool called CARPE, which stands for Carbon Reduction Assessment Potential. And it doesn't quite work, but it's the words are in there somewhere. But anyway, American Farmland Trust deals with a lot of land use data. We have the best land use collection analysis in the country. We do the work for USDA. The Comet Farm has done amazing work on looking at how practices can result in carbon sequestration. We put the 2 sets of data together, and there's a tool now on our website. You can go play with it. It's a lot of fun, that will allow you to go in and look at different scenarios of carbon sequestration potential based on real actual farms and what's being grown on them now and what practices could be implemented. These are the kind of things that weren't available a few years ago, and they give me real hope, and policymakers are increasingly turning to them. So it's not just pie in the sky. This is not just someone saying, you know, regenerative practices can really make a huge difference to help heal our planet. It's there. Then what gives me hope is that the practices exist. Some of them are thousands of years old, others are being refined all the time, but the practices are there, and we just have to have the will to make them happen. That's on the climate side. You also asked about food insecurity, and in my mind, the two are completely interconnected, right? If we don't solve the climate issue, we've got bigger problems with food insecurity, and if we take the same path with regenerative agriculture that can make a huge dent in the climate, we will have a lot of what we need to address food insecurity. So I'm hopeful.
That's great. We just had passage in the U.S. context of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest investment in agriculture, in conservation agriculture since the Dust Bowl.
Yep.
So this administration is putting its money where its mouth is for the time being. I'm curious, Simon, you mentioned in your response that you're starting to see a shift in incentives internationally towards smarter, more resilient systems. What's an example or a couple of examples of how you're seeing that shift happen?
So it's definitely happening at a macro level. So we're tracking quite a bit what's happening now, both in the public let's say donor world, the multilaterals and the bilateral donors. There's an increasing array of programs that want to promote regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture, and so on. You're also having these purpose-driven institutions like the Green Climate Fund, which was set up by the UN several years back and has a very specific mandate to promote mitigation and adaptation in low-income countries, in Africa, in small island states. But the challenge, the biggest challenge with this is that these are macro schemes. The pathway, the sort of engineering lattice work to get these big incentive schemes and big international programs to trickle down, and not just hope for trickle down, but actually to do the engineering so they purposefully trickle down, so they end up in incentives that actually affect farmers in their fields and local businesses that are interacting with those farmers, whether as input suppliers or off-takers. That's not really there in most cases yet. And that was the sort of caution piece that I was alluding to before in my remarks, is we need to put all that engineering in place so that these funds can actually flow, and they're either coming from regional development banks or the World Bank and so on, and then into countries' budgets, and those budgets are then enabled to deploy those funds into the right kind of incentive programs for farmers, or they're coming more directly through the private sector or private sector enhancement schemes and so on. But there's a big barrier, which is most of those institutions, and we're talking to many of them, they don't know what it is, right? How do you actually precisely define regenerative agriculture or climate smart agriculture in that particular context? And then how do you incentivize it in that particular context? So there's a big definitional piece that still has to happen, and then there's a big measurement piece. And the carbon side is much more mature. I mean, we have carbon markets. Yes, they still need work, and yes, they still don't work very effectively in the countries where we're focused. But at least if you can measure the carbon, you can monetize it. But the problem is that the measurement is so expensive, it's completely out of the reach of the kind of smallholders that we're working with. So part of that engineering has to be to come up with much simpler, easy to measure, at scale systems so that those incentives can actually reach the very farmers that they're trying to. Our farmers do not have John Deere machinery, with satellite, connectivity and sensors all over them that are, generating this data. And we have to find, appropriate, right-sized alternatives for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You hit on an issue that my colleagues and I often run up against, which is how do you define regenerative agriculture? And this focus on needing to define what regenerative agriculture is kind of sucks the air out of a room, especially in policy conversations, right? And I understand it's a philosophy of farming. It is, an umbrella term. It's a big sort of systems approach context, and there is no clear definition because of that systems approach. And I worry, and we can, walk around eggshells on this issue a little bit, but I do worry about the greenwashing that happens because of the systems approach to agriculture, because there is no clear one-size-fits-all definition to this philosophy of farming. I do worry about greenwashing. We're starting to see, companies, nonprofits, multinationals use this phrase more in their advocacy, more in their marketing, more in their campaign. But so for this group of folks who've joined us this afternoon, what's one misconception of regenerative agriculture that you would want this audience to walk away having a better understanding of, so that, if they do come across greenwashing efforts, they are advocates and champions for reform? And Michael, Dr. Johnson.
I think that leads me to how we define success. I think, we can throw numbers at all we want to, but unless there's people behind it, unless you see people behind it, we don't know what success is. And I think, for me, one thing I would like people to learn with regenerative agriculture is that, we have different communities, different pockets of people, different races of people. We all define success differently. And if I'm a donor, I sure would like to see what success really looks like. I would feel good if I donate to somebody and say, look, your community's healthy. That's because, people like the Zuni Youth Enrichment Project have their own version of success. They have trouble getting funding because it's different. It's not number-based. It's the health of the community-based. Like, how do you feel, what makes you, how are your kids doing? It's kind of a value-based success system, But unfortunately, a lot of philanthropists, even the federal government, want to see it just numbers. We want to see our deliverables, and that's fine and dandy. That can go hand in hand with that. But we also have to have things like success. Look, if you look at NRCS conservation plans, for example, it's all just systematically brought out. There's no little thing in there for culture. What if we had culture? Then we'd be able to participate more fully, because that would balance the equation. Because a lot of what we do as indigenous people, especially when it comes to agriculture, is grow things for our community, not for profit, not for economic gain. And so there's a little difference there. So if we were to redefine success and maybe put that into some of our funding categories, what does success look like in your community, then that opens up a lot of doors, a lot of opportunities for something small to become big. But we first have to ask that question, and so that's where I'll leave it at that. But yeah.
I'm glad that you brought that. When we were doing our interviews with growers, we were profoundly moved with how much the concept of joy and the concept of mental health came out from those conversations, right? As soon as farmers and ranchers felt re-empowered and the decision-making power was back in the hands of farmers and ranchers by transitioning to regenerative agriculture, they were talking about how happy they were to make decisions based on their own farm. They were happy to feel comfortable inviting families with small kids to field days because they didn't have to worry as much about chemical spray. That was a decision that they were able to make. So I'm glad that you brought up that qualitative component of regenerative agriculture. John?
Well, first off, I share your concerns about greenwashing, and having worked with farmers now professionally for close to 35 years, I've seen it with local, I've seen it with organic, I've seen it with sustainable. I mean, so it's sort of natural and maybe inevitable in some ways. And I just come back to what I said at the beginning. You do have to take a systems approach. That's not a bad thing. That's an important and critical thing. But at the same time, we have to sort of just not get hung up on some of the terminology. But I do have one particular misconception I want to call attention to. This won't surprise you, because my organization does a lot of work thinking about the land itself rather than the practices on the land. And that misconception is, a lot of people think, oh, we just have to farm regeneratively and everything will take care of itself. But the truth is that it's wonderful that regenerative practices can both grow food and provide essential environmental services. That's great. That's a win-win. That's fantastic. But you can't maximize both on a single parcel. If you were trying to get every calorie of food production out of that land, it's going to come with some environmental downsides. And this gets to an issue which maybe isn't as big an issue in other parts of the world, but it very much is in the United States, where we lose 2,000 acres of farmland a day. And that is, as we lose land, we not only lose land that could itself be growing food and generating environmental benefits, but we put more stress on the remaining land to be farmed more intensely. So my misconception is we can't think of practices alone. We have to think of practices and land and a whole bunch of other societal things that I mentioned before. But that's my misconception is you cannot compartmentalize this. We have to keep the systems view in mind at all times.
Amen. Simon.
So I was going to say something quite similar, so now I'll have to build on it.
Sorry.
But it's interesting that you have this, very U.S.-centric focus. I have very much a Africa, Asia-centric focus, but we end up having the same kind of observation. So the build on it is we have to help farmers use the land that they're currently farming as efficiently and as productively as possible with as precise and specific a use of inputs as is possible. But we have to recognize that's not always going to be organic. And I think that's also a misconception, that regenerative agriculture is sometimes seen as organic agriculture. And it may be in certain contexts that that's the right solution, but in other contexts you probably still need, and in our context in particular, the kinds of smallholders we're working with are typically using very little in terms of outside inputs at all on their farms. And in order to optimize the production potential of their land, they actually need to modestly increase the use of, and in some cases it's going to be chemical inputs or mineral inputs. So we try and guide them to how to do that in the most agroecologically sustainable fashion. That's another buzzword that is sometimes also confused with regenerative agriculture. But agroecology then brings in the values thing, it brings in the culture thing, it brings in the social aspects of, how a community is staying together or even strengthening through these processes, and that's very important. So my wrap-up of all of that is to say, back to what you were saying, Michael, it's about the outcomes.
Yep.
It's really about the outcomes, and then what is the most resource-efficient and socially empowering way of achieving those outcomes, not these other things like organic or, some very simplistic reference back to practices.
This is the problem with going last on a panel, is that they all said the things that I would have said in my answer. So I'll have Simon's problem, which is building on that. I'll open up and ask for some vulnerability with you all. It is my personal mission in life to get the hashtag #SoilIsSexy trending on Twitter. So thank you for letting me share that publicly. And the reason I share that is to build on this conversation that we're having, which is, I completely agree with you, John, that there is a tendency to focus on practice, like the checkbox of practices to make the claim that you are regenerative. I think there's also a tendency for the carbon component of regenerative agriculture to, again, suck the room out of conversations about regenerative agriculture's potential to mitigate climate change and to combat food insecurity. There are so many other incredible benefits that healthy soil provides, not just increased carbon sequestration, increased carbon management within the soil ecosystem, but you also see increased water conservation, which is great for farmers and ranchers who are fighting increasing drought conditions across the world. You see cleaner water leaving farms during heavy precipitation events, and that's beneficial for watersheds downstream. You see better nutrient cycling, which reduces the need for farmers and ranchers to use synthetic inputs or organic inputs. Like all of those other facets of soil health, of regenerative agriculture, I think get lost in the conversation. So that is my tertiary build, quadruple build from what you all said. I know we have a few minutes, I think 10 minutes left maybe? No. We are Can we get one question from the audience? Oh. Does someone want to use their diaphragm and project a question? It's a good public speaking practice opportunity.
Or we can just wrap up.
Or we can just
Wrap up. Let's just wrap it up.
All right, seeing none. My wrap-up question, one sentence. If you could wave your magic wand and convince the government of your choice to do one thing to catalyze regenerative agriculture, what would you ask them to do? John, let's start with you.
Wow. Well, we wave this wand all the time, and it sometimes doesn't work. I'm not sure I can do it in a minute, but I'm going to talk fast and try. So there's
One sentence, not 1 minute.
Oh, one sentence. That's what semicolons are for. So at the heart of all of this, we ultimately need to support farmers not only for the food they grow, but for the environmental services that they provide. And markets have a role in that, and government has a role in that. And we need to do both. And government has taken relatively few steps, U.S. government, to actually support farmers for the broader environmental benefits that they are providing. I think that's critical.
That's great.
I think we need to basically figure out a way to substitute a new formula than the current one that is based upon quantity and efficiency and start looking more at quality of what we produce. Thank you.
Repurpose the subsidies so they support regenerative agricultural outcomes that are good for the farms and good for people's incomes.
Here.
And I'll say, my magic wand, I would ask that farm policy center soil and soil health ad infinitum.
Good.
Cool.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Hopefully
for
you learned
everybody.
something new.
Thank you.